Yes.
Well, thanks for the interesting talk. Can I just want to ask about causal direction here when you think about private property on the one hand and freedom on the other. So I guess first of all, might the reason why they co-occur at least much to do with people who have freedom in other respects, saying, hey, we want private property rights. And two, just with regard to China, do you think that increases in private property there will inevitably lead to more democratic freedom?
In China?
Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, originally it was private property that allowed people to say to the government, stop. I mean, we've seen it clearly in England. Is that people who own property say to the government, you cannot tax us, we will tell you how much you can tax us. Okay? Otherwise, you're a tyrant. And if you're a tyrant, we're going to behead you.
Okay.
In China, it's very interesting development. It's incompatible. What happens in China is utterly incompatible with communism. You know, Marx and Engels, in 1848, wrote the Communist Manifesto, wrote in it that if you want to define communism in one sentence, it is the abolition of private property. And you cannot have private property together with communism. So what I think is going to happen, and it's happening already, that the people who acquire wealth, and there's very considerable wealth in China today, it's not just small peanuts, money, will demand rights. Originally maybe personal rights and eventually political rights. So my belief is that eventually the Chinese government will have to either wither away or else collapse under this pressure. Incidentally, my book, Property and Freedom, was translated into Chinese and published by the State Publishing House in Beijing earlier in this decade, which is astonishing and completely contradictory. They changed the title. They don't like freedom, so they named it, instead of property and freedom, they named it a discussion of property. Yes?
Explain what you mean by the government would wither away.
How what?
The government would wither away?
Well, how does the government wither away? The way it did over several centuries in England. I mean, the government didn't wither away in the centuries, it disappeared, but it became a servant of the people. I mean, when the Normans invaded England, they were the masters and the people were servants. A few hundred years later, they became the government became the servant and the people became the masters, which is true in all democracies. Now, how this will happen is hard to say. I did not predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. I thought that the regime is going to wither away, and the Chinese example, gradually concede power. That's what we mean, withering away. But it can happen in various ways. You now see constantly in the press articles about Chinese demanding more freedom, demanding freedom of the press, and having a voice in government. And then eventually that becomes loud enough, it will have an effect. Yes?
Based on what you said about private property in Russia historically, what effect do you think the privatization will have on Russia now?
Today?
Yeah.
Well, it has an effect, of course. Russia is not a longer totalitarian regime. But if you look at public opinion polls, Russians pay very little respect to private property. I think when they're asked, do you consider private property a basic right? Something like 24% say yes. The other 75% say either I don't know, I don't care, or I don't think so. The Russians have a very strong egalitarian instinct, and they don't like the fact that private property creates different classes with different rights. That there are people who can do things and the people who cannot do things. There are people who have dachas or summer houses outside of Moscow and people who cannot afford it. That runs against their instincts, and to them, equality is more important than freedom. That is how they've been trained by their history. But that has deep roots in Russian psyche. Russians are not socialized and not politicized. They basically see themselves as an island. They, their family, their friends, and they are surrounded by enemies. And one Russian public opinion outfit said that Russians concluded that Russians live in trenches. They think they're surrounded by enemies. And therefore they want a very strong government which will protect them from the neighbors. So when they are asked, as they were in the province of Voronezh, about 10 years ago. What is more important to you? Freedom or order? 84% said order. Now, I think one should have said, I want both. I mean, they're not incompatible. But no, for them, they're incompatible. To them, freedom is anarchy and crime. Because the only 2 or 3 times in the history when they had something resembling freedom, and the autocracy vanished, they had chaos and anarchy and crime. And that even happened in the 1990s. Yeah.
How does eminent domain play into the property freedom in the United States?
What about the problem in the United States?
How does eminent domain?
Eminent domain. Well, yes, that I also worry about eminent domain because there was this case, I forgot the name of it, in Connecticut. What?
Kilo, K-E-L.
Kilo, yeah.
Kilo.
Well, what they do now, or have done, they take a private property into the public domain, not because it is needed for public services, but because they give it or sell it to private enterprise who bring more taxes, which is what happened in this case. And there's really an abuse of the principle of eminent domain.
Since people have such a natural propensity to want property, how come throughout the course of history most societies end up being totalitarian, feudal, and now we're even going into the cycle of socialism in a lot of places?
No, they're not totalitarian. The totalitarian is a modern phenomenon. 20th century. Soviet Union was the first, and then came Nazi Germany to some extent. Mussolini coined the term, but Italy was not a totalitarian state.
Right, but totalitarian impact of Pharaonic Egypt, the Spartan state, where people were ceding so much of their private property to the government.
Well, because the government would not grant it to them. I mean, legal property is a legal term, and you have to have institutions such as courts, which grant it to you, give you a piece of paper saying this is yours, and the government didn't want to give it, so there was no private property, even though people wanted it. Today in Egypt, it takes, I've read some figures, how long it takes to get title to your land. You possess it, but without a title. And it takes years to get title, because bureaucracy is so loath to give it. So in our society, private enterprise is welcome, because the government knows that if the private entrepreneur succeeds, it will be rich. The government will be getting taxes. I recall when we came to the United States, we fled from Poland during the war, and we came to a small town in upstate New York, Elmira. My father wanted to open a little business, a candy factory, and he didn't speak good English. I went with him to the city hall, and for $2 he got a paper allowing him to open this little factory. He said in Poland it will take him months and hundreds of dollars to get the permit, because our society is oriented towards business. It promotes business because it knows business is good for people, business is good for the state. Yes.
So you mentioned the Chinese government, how it could wither away. Is the opposite of that possible? And not in China, obviously, but where a government gradually takes more and more power? Is that how it could happen in the United States?
No, it's happening, for example, in Guatemala, where Chavez is, am I right in Guatemala? Venezuela, sorry. Where Chavez is gradually taking over the property of the country, becoming a total dictator. No, in our country, I think this is utterly impossible. In China, it is possible. That it's possible that when the government feels that the challenges to its authority are so strong that it may fall, then it may crack down, and you may have a reaction. It's possible. But in the long run, I think, well, then they'll have to sacrifice private property and then become much more poorer. They're now an incredibly rich country. I mean, they are buying things. What did I read just in today's paper? That they are buying up something you would never consider possibly that could be Chinese, but oh yes, a winery in Napa Valley in California. Chinese bought it, I mean, because they're drinking more wine. So if they did that, and they might considerably do it, they would kill the source of their wealth, and that gives them tremendous power internationally.
But if private property, if an instinct towards private property is as universal and hardwired in human nature as you suggest, as you argue that it is, why wouldn't you expect the default setting for almost all human civilizations, human societies,